Thank you everyone for joining the CSAE Development Economics Webinar. I'm just going to go through a couple of the rules before we get started. So Jenny Aker is going to be presenting for 45 minutes. And during this time, if you have any clarifying questions, can you please use the Q&A function box to type in your question, and we may read these out to the speaker at a convenient time. At the end, we're then going to have 10 minutes for questions, and during this time, you can use the raise your hand functionality, and if we choose you, we'll then unmute you and you can ask your question directly. So today, I'm really excited to welcome Jenny Aker from Tufts University, and she's going to be presenting Harvesting the Rain, the adoption of environmental technologies in the Sahel. So thank you very much, Jenny. We're really excited for your presentation.
Thank you for having me. All right, so thanks everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and see you all, at least virtually. Obviously, I wish that we could all be together, and hopefully that will happen sometime soon. This topic is about the adoption of environmental technologies in the Sahel. It's joint work with my co-author, Kelsey Jack, who is a professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara. It's also joint work with our partners, the Ministry of Environment and the Sahel Consulting Group in Niger. And this is part of a kind of a broader research agenda that I've been working on now for the past 10 or 12 years, which is really looking at kind of constraints to the adoption of agriculture, environmental, and information technologies. And then if and when those constraints are alleviated, what happens to adoption? What also happens to other kind of measures of welfare? And so kind of broadly speaking, why we might be interested in this topic is because, you know, we've seen this almost doubling of agricultural yields worldwide since the 1960s. That hasn't necessarily been the case in sub-Saharan Africa, although there are a number of potential reasons for this. Kind of one of the things that we often point to is land size, and also land quality. It's estimated that about 50% of the farmland in Sahelian West Africa suffers from poor soil fertility. And we think of the Sahel as this kind of brown band, which is in between the Sahara and the coast, that goes all the way across sub-Saharan Africa. And the way in which many farmers in the Sahel have dealt with kind of poor soil quality is via extensification, right? So they're using smaller amounts of inputs kind of as compared with the land under cultivation. The issue has been, though, that, you know, with kind of higher population density and shorter fallow periods, this means that less arable land is actually available to small-scale farmers. And so then kind of in order for, you know, these sustained yield improvements to kind of persist within the Sahel, they require intensive agricultural practices, namely that are going to increase the level and duration of water in the soil and simultaneously replete soil nutrients. There's a number of ways to do this. Many of you might have heard about conservation agriculture, which is quite popular. That being said, that isn't necessarily appropriate for the semi-arid lands of Sahelian West Africa because kind of crop cover competes with livestock fodder. And so one way that has often been promoted, and some of these are indigenous techniques as well, is via rainwater harvesting. Now, what are these? These are very simple micro catchment techniques that are constructed within your own land. And they are designed in order to meet these dual objectives of kind of capturing rainwater, increasing the duration of water within the soil, and at the same time, by kind of removing the topsoil, replenishing some of these soil nutrients. There are a number of them to use, but the one that we're going to be focusing on today is something known as the Demi-Lune, which literally means half moon. You can see it here to the right-hand side. This is after it's been constructed and there's rainwater in it. And the main construction requires labor, these upfront costs, but the maintenance is cheap. Now, you know, despite the fact, though, that there's been decades of investment in promoting these technologies, just over the course of the past 6 years, about $10 million has been spent in Niger alone, and some kind of farm trials that suggest that they're beneficial in terms of reducing soil erosion, reducing crop failure, and increasing yields and profits. The sustained adoption of these techniques remains really low. And in Niger, the area where we're going to be focusing today, it's estimated that about fewer than 10% of farmers are using these techniques on any parts of their land. Now, the reasons for this might be multiple. There might be information constraints in terms of knowing what these techniques are or how to implement them. There might be liquidity constraints. You know, we need kind of income up front to pay for these labor costs. If people have high discount rates, the fact that, you know, the benefits are primarily after 2 or 3 years, all of these things might be discouraging adoption. And so the focus of our research is really to try and answer this question, why is the adoption of this seemingly profitable technology so low? We do this by using a field experiment in Niger, which is designed to relax kind of the specific constraints to adoption, which we developed in the course of a pilot work that had been done about 6 years ago to identify some of these potential constraints. And we do this by looking at one control group and then 4 different treatments. Every treatment gets an information intervention, which is going to be a training, and I'll talk a little bit about that in about 5 or 10 minutes. And then the second component is some type of cash transfer program, whether an unconditional cash transfer program or a conditional cash transfer program designed to alleviate these liquidity, but also kind of the time profile of cost and benefit constraints. We have 1 year of intervention, so only did this in 2018, but then we've been collecting data over time, which allows us to really see the dynamics of adoption over time. And because I have about 45 minutes just to kind of preview some of these results, what we basically find is that all of these treatments, as compared with the control, increase the adoption of Demi-Lunes along the extensive and intensive margin. About 95% of treated farmers are adopting at least 1 Demi-Lune. So kind of the take up is quite high. But if you're looking at the intensive margin, they're adopting about 25 Demi-Lunes per hectare of degraded land. It's relatively higher in the unconditional cash transfer and the conditional cash transfer arms as compared with the training group. I'll talk a little bit about what that means in terms of kind of the norms that the Ministry of Environment actually suggests. If we kind of go downstream a little bit in terms of land and labor and agricultural production, what we find is that kind of agricultural production is higher, as is asset ownership and food security, about 9 months after the intervention. This is related to about an increase of $40 US in agricultural revenues. That's about 15% higher as compared with the control group. And there aren't any statistically significant differences between the treatments for these downstream impacts. We find that in the 2nd and 3rd years, adoption persists. So people aren't disadopting, and it's kind of slightly higher in the treatment group, but there's also spillovers on your neighbors as well. And overall, we find that kind of this seems to be something that is being taken up by at least 95% of the population. So I'm going to just stop it here to see whether or not there's any questions for clarification, but then move on if there's not.
There aren't any clarifying questions at this point, so please continue.
Great.
Sorry, can I ask one?
Sure, sure.
I can't get into the Q&A to put it down. So I may have missed this, but do people do the labor themselves, or they hire people to do the labor?
It's both. So what we find in our sample is that about half is family labor and half is hired labor. Okay. Yep.
Thanks.
And I'll talk a little bit, Chris, about kind of what the costs are and what this means. And so this speaks to kind of 2 broad areas of the literature. There's growing research on looking at training and information services and what that means for adoption for technologies and the returns to those technologies. And what they basically find is, the effectiveness of training can be quite sensitive to the information content. But what we found in this review, although the Barrett et al. Paper is an exception to this, is that training is rarely evaluated to a pure control group. There's also kind of a wide literature on the effectiveness of CCTs versus UCTs in education, amongst others. The impacts are quite mixed, and also there are kind of very few in agriculture. And so kind of we think that we're, for now, speaking to these 2 areas of literature. But to give you a little bit of information about the context in Niger, and I'm going to spend some time on kind of the context of Niger and the agricultural season related to Chris's comment about kind of labor, because I think that these things are really important for understanding how this technology works and what that means for the allocation of labor and inputs over time. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with Niger, it's one of the lowest ranked countries on the UN's Human Development Index. It has about a GDP per capita of about $551. The primary sources of income are agriculture, livestock, and wages earned from migration. Migration primarily happens in the off season, so when people aren't working on the farm. And there's only kind of 1 rainy season per year, so there's a unimodal rainfall distribution. So basically kind of that's your one shot in terms of it. And subject to kind of frequent droughts as well. So in terms of about 94% of the population lives on about 20% of the land area. Population growth rate has been quite high over the course of the past 20 to 30 years. It's about 3.8%, and about half of that land suffers from degradation to a huge cost. And in fact, in our baseline survey, about 65% of households say that land quality was their binding constraint. So, one of the ways to deal with poor land quality is these rainwater harvesting techniques. Just to give you an idea of kind of what exists, these Zai and Tasa to the left-hand side of your screen were basically developed within Burkina Faso. Demi-lunes were ones that were introduced about 30 years ago in a northern area of Niger. And let me tell you a little bit about how this technology works and kind of why we decided to focus on them. All of these are potentially appropriate for Niger, the type of degraded soil in Niger. But for those of you who aren't soil scientists or agronomists, there are different types of degraded soils. And so not all of these are going to be appropriate for every type of soil. So the Demi-Lune is appropriate for what we call lateritic soils. And we can think about this, that if you have degraded land, lateritic soils, meaning soils that really have lost all of their soil nutrients. They were once quite fertile, but with the sun and the wind, they became baked and they became something that's called a glacis. It's almost like glass. So basically nothing grows there. And what you can see on the right-hand side is this area that is not in green is what we call a glacis. So it used to be quite fertile, and then basically with the sun baking into it, it's just basically kind of been devoid of all nutrients. And so when it rains, nothing grows there, not even grassland. And so the Demi-Lune is appropriate for these types of soils. And they're basically quite large. They're 2 by 4 meters in dimension. And in terms of their depth, it's about kind of up to your elbow. And that's going to be important in terms of kind of capturing rainwater, but not too much so that they drown your crops. Now, the ministry and CGIAR recommend about 250 to 300 Demi-Lunes per hectare. They're scattered throughout the plot, and I'll show you what that looks like. Kind of based upon our discussions with the ministry and others, this is purely kind of a mechanical way of coming up with the norms. So there hasn't necessarily been a kind of a cost benefit analysis. If you really look at kind of, 1 hectare and then you space out the Demi-Lunes and you look at that spacing, it's going to basically get you to 300 Demi-Lunes per hectare. And the way in which Demi-Lunes are going to be kind of dispersed shows here on the left-hand side, where you see that you have a Demi-Lune. There's going to be about 4 meters in between each one. And then you have the ones behind them in between. And this is all kind of for the rainwater capturing. This is just it's a better catchment area. They should be constructed at a time when you're not kind of harvesting your crops or planting or preparing it. So that's going to be in the off agricultural season. And then the whole idea here is that you can use them for kind of forestry. You can use them for communal land. You can also use them for individual land. And then kind of you can plant crops, millet, sorghum, cowpea, and sesame in and around the Demi-Lunes. The costs of these are mainly upfront costs, as I said previously, and they're mainly labor costs. So on 1 kind of hectare for this 250 to 300 Demi-Lunes, it's going to cost about $80, and that's quite expensive. If you look at kind of the per capita income that I showed you previously, it's about 25 cents a Demi-Lune. And again, kind of the main cost of this is labor. There are also smaller costs of about $5 of a shovel and a pickaxe. And once you've constructed them, they last 3 years. You don't really need to do anything up until the 3rd year, and then it requires a little bit of maintenance. And again, that maintenance would be about kind of $5 or $10. So questions or clarification for any of those?
I don't see any questions at this point. Okay. So I think continue, please.
So as we said previously, based upon some work that we had done, on a pilot in about 2014 and 2015, and some qualitative work, we were trying to really understand what were the constraints to adoption on individual plots of land. And there's kind of 3 main areas that I talked about in the beginning. One is that, households might lack information about Demi-Lunes or their appropriate construction. So the idea here that training could kind of increase information on both of these. Secondly, that given these high upfront costs, households might be credit constrained, and so they don't have the liquidity to hire labor or pay for other construction costs. So then their unconditional cash can relax those liquidity constraints. And then, as I said previously, there are going to be some benefits in the 1st year, but really you're going to see kind of higher benefits in the 2nd or 3rd year in terms of soil fertility, soil quality, agricultural production. And so, those benefits might just be too long-term relative to their costs. And so, conditional cash can raise the immediate payoff of these. And so that's how we designed our interventions, saying, okay, we're going to compare these to a peer control group, at least for kind of the past 3 years. We have a training. Everyone gets the training. kind of based upon the fact that kind of information is an important constraint here on how to construct these demi-lunes. That was done in February early on to give people sufficient time up until May or June to actually construct them. Then we offered an unconditional cash transfer in addition to the training of $20, so about a fourth of the costs of kind of full construction on 1 hectare of land. That was offered in March after the trainings. We also offered a CCT, so the people were paid for kind of every single demi-lune of acceptable quality that they constructed. That was in May or June, so obviously after people had actually constructed their demi-lunes. And then we have what's called a UCT late. So, they got their cash transfer equivalent to the value of the early UCT of $20, although kind of a small correction for inflation of about 50 cents. And that was paid at the same time as the CCT. So you see, we have kind of a few things going on here just to kind of fix ideas. First of all, the trainings were announced after the baseline. So we did the baseline and then we announced the trainings to everyone at the same time. Secondly, that we announced the cash transfers after we had actually done the trainings. So we didn't want selection into the trainings based upon whether or not you were in the cash transfer group. And third of all, you can see that we're changing 2 things about kind of the cash transfer mechanism. One is kind of the modality. Is it a UCT or a CCT? And 2 is the timing. And that's really kind of one of the reasons that we had this UCT late. We were interested in doing the CCT for 2 reasons. One, because we wanted to see whether it affected kind of the valuation of benefits and costs. But you have to do that in May or June because you can't do it until people have actually constructed their demi-lunes. And so we were changing both timing and modality. 2, because from a policy perspective, NGOs, policymakers, and the government almost all without fail use a CCT or something equivalent like a cash for work or a food for work. And so we wanted to kind of be able to see whether or not kind of the timing was something that was important. That being said, if you got kind of the CCT or the UCT late, we announced it at the same time that we announced all of the cash transfers. So if people were rolling into their planning, they could do that knowing that the cash would be coming. So all of these things were designed kind of with the growing season in mind and also the construction of demi-lunes. This just gives you an idea visually of the agricultural season in Niger. So basically kind of the agricultural season goes from June up until December. That's a period when it isn't appropriate to construct demi-lunes. We did all of our interventions before that, starting back in January or February, so that at least with information, people had ample time to kind of construct demi-lunes before the early rains. The optimal period for constructing demi-lunes coincides with the slack agricultural period, but at the same point in time, if there is some seasonal migration, so about 50 to 60% of our households have at least one household member who engages in seasonal migration, going to Nigeria or Ghana or Ivory Coast or Senegal. This is going to be at about the same time period. And again, kind of this is something that will be competing potentially with labor for constructing demi-lunes. So the training intervention, just to give you a little bit of information about that, is that we worked with the Ministry of the Environment. There were 2 elements to it that I think were important, which is one, it was done that, of these 16 people who were chosen for the training, I'll talk a little bit about our selection process. It was very visual. So first they had kind of an interactive session on what demi-lunes were and how they could be constructed. And then, people went out together and constructed 3 demi-lunes together to understand how these things worked at a plot of land that was kind of offered up by someone within the village. Secondly, they were provided with a book. So the book was in French, but more importantly, it was in Hausa. So we translated it in Hausa. It had kind of step-by-step instructions on how demi-lunes were actually constructed. Rates of illiteracy in Niger are 85%. So the book, even though it was written in Hausa, it had a lot of visual imagery. So everything was done by kind of images, and it was provided to the beneficiaries as a reference that they could use kind of after the training was finished. And third, that something that's really important is that kind of everything that we did in practice, previous NGOs and the ministry introduced new types of technologies. So kind of a special A-frame to construct demi-lunes, or certain types of compasses and certain types of measuring units. And we encouraged and worked with the Ministry of Environment to just use kind of simple walking out with your steps to kind of trace out the demi-lunes, so that you didn't need special material to actually construct them, other than a shovel or a pickaxe, which is something that you could find readily available on local markets. So the targeting of these is that we were working in 180 villages, 16 farmers per village, stratified by gender. basically they had to have about 0.5 to 5 hectares of degraded land in order to be eligible to participate. And of these, we randomly assigned them to these 4 interventions plus a peer control, basically 40 villages within every single treatment, with the exception of the UCT late and the peer control. And those power calculations were done based upon our pilot work. And then we have assignment at the village level and stratified by geography and use the min-max T-stat method in order to kind of ensure balance before we started. So I'll stop there just to see if there's any questions about those.
I think Chris has a question.
I've got one again. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to get my head around how big the transfers are relative to what we expect people to be spending. So $80 per acre. So you've been pretty clear on that, $80 per acre, and I'm going to give them $20. But then you said between 1/2 and 5 hectares of land. So that's quite a big variation. What should we expect to happen in a sense if somebody has 5 hectares of land? What do we expect them to do? Just do something on 1 hectare, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. So so they had to have between 0.5 and 5 hectares of land. What you'll see here is that they ended up on average having 4, and of those 4 hectares, about half of them are degraded. What we've seen in the past is that of that degraded land, then the land needs to be glacis, which is like at the appropriate. And so again, that's going to be about 65 to 75% of all degraded land. So you could say maybe 1.25 or 1.3 hectares. And then what we've seen is then what people will do is they will start in 1 plot of land. In the way that you construct it, you could put them all throughout the plot, but they're not going to be as effective in terms of capturing the rainwater. So they would go into 1 plot and they would test it on that 1 plot, right? So they would kind of construct in 1 row and then the other row and then the other row and test it on that plot of land. So I wouldn't think about it as kind of dispersing yourself or spreading yourself too thin to be doing it on a bunch of different plots. And what we'll see is that the people were really testing to see whether or not it worked. The amount that we gave was kind of consistent with some of the results that we had kind of in a pilot previously in terms of levels of adoption that we had seen. And so we allocated it based upon kind of that. I don't know if that answered your question.
And then you're going to tell us something about the follow-on from that initial. So that sounds like I'm encouraging learning, and then they're going to learn something, and then I want to see if there's follow-on from that. So you're going to tell us something about that?
I will tell you something about that in terms of, the punchline is that there's increased adoption in the 2nd and the 3rd year, but it's not remotely kind of at the rates that we see in the 1st year. And then kind of the big puzzle is going to be why. That's I think the punchline.
And then we have another question from Victor.
Yes, I have a question on the unconditional cash transfer. Here, in a sense, you are doing a training, so you are telling people how to build the Demi-Lune, and then you are giving them unconditional cash transfer. Are you sure that it was really perceived unconditional? Because in a sense, it's kind of a labeled cash transfer, in a sense.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, there's 2 things, is that 1, we gave the training, and then about a month later, we told people about the cash. So, there was this little bit of a time element, and 2, we did have very clear scripts in terms of kind of the way in which the cash transfers were talked about. So, is it possible? Sure, it's possible in terms of, whether or not people had kind of this in their mind. But we're able to see a little bit about how kind of the UCT group late, performed, which was consistently worse. And I'll show you that. But we try to be quite careful in terms of the framing of this and the timing of this and the way in which they were kind of explained that the UCT was really a UCT and they were free to do whatever they wanted to with it.
And then Simon had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Just briefly, I'm probably showing my ignorance, but I'm wondering if you can just tell us what the min-max T-stat method is here. And also, you might be coming to this, whether it has implications for the way that you then conduct inference.
Yeah, right. So basically what we did is we stratified, then we randomly assigned, and then we had these particular household level characteristics where we checked for kind of the balance of across all of the different treatments with respect to those characteristics. And then if there wasn't balance, then we would kind of correct for that. It does have implications for inference, and then we correct for that during our inference. So that's something that we have to be careful
Great.
about.
Thank you.
Yeah, but thank you.
Okay, please continue.
So for the data, we have a lot of data in terms of, we had a baseline starting in the very beginning. Then we did kind of verification, phone surveys, midterm. I'm going to talk a little bit about all of them, but I just want you to focus on these three sets of data. So these three sets of data are Demi-Lune adoption, where basically we had enumerators who verified the number of Demi-Lunes constructed and their quality and other things. The first year, then a year later, and then kind of the third year. You know, we did kind of all of the interventions between basically kind of February and May of 2018. So that's what we're going to be relying on for all of our adoption measures. And then kind of for today, when we're looking at kind of some of these other measures in terms of labor allocation, land, agricultural production, and things like that, we're going to be relying upon this midterm survey that was done after the first year. So, you know, again, we're going to be capturing any effects that happened in the first year. We're planning to go in for our final household survey in January, February 2020 to see whether or not there's any kind of longer, 2021, sorry, gosh, 2020 has been really long, whether or not there's any kind of longer term accrued benefits over this. So this is what I'm going to be focusing on. The rates of attrition were extremely low through all of these, less than about 1%, with the exception of the midline. The midline, it was about 14% attrition, and it was slightly lower, about 3 percentage points lower in the treatment group. And so that's something that we correct for by using Lee bounds. But just to give you an idea of how these things were measured, that we have external verification. So just to give you an idea of who's in our sample, about half of our sample is female because we constructed it that way. They have 4 adult household members. So average household sizes in Niger is about 9. So 4 adults. About 48% of them own a mobile phone, and kind of this comes from our listing exercise, as I said to Chris. They own about 4 hectares, and you know, not quite half of those are going to be degraded. And as I said previously, about 60 to 70% of those are glacis, which is this particular type of land that's appropriate for Demi-Lunes. About 30% of them had Demi-Lune experience, and what this means in particular within this context is that maybe they worked for a project. So the project or a government, you know, would often come in, kind of pay people to do Demi-Lunes on communal land with the hope of kind of recuperating grassland for livestock. And then people would kind of work for that on a cash for work or a food for work basis. Now, overall, there's balance across these treatments with the control, but also kind of between the treatments. I'm not showing all that here, but happy to show that. With the exception of kind of a few areas, which is, and one of them is being the Demi-Lune experience. And so this is something that we also kind of control for in ANCOVA. And there's a kind of a number of other baseline results. So in terms of our empirical strategy, it's pretty straightforward in terms of we have these outcomes. I'm going to be mainly looking at adoption, the cost of construction, labor and land usage, agricultural production, and well-being. We're also going to be asking questions about knowledge, particularly related to Demi-Lunes. We have these 4 right-hand side variables that are measuring the intention to treat for assignment to one of these treatments. We have these stratification fixed effects, and then, you know, getting back to Simon's points, then we have these listing covariants that were used for the min-max t-stat method. We're correcting our standard errors and clustering at the village level. And most of the regressions I'm going to be showing you are cross-sectional. And then I'm going to, at the end, show you kind of the dynamics of Demi-Lune adoption over time, where then we're going to be using the kind of some of this pooled data. Okay, so I just stopped there again if there's any clarification before I move on.
I'm not seeing any questions from anyone, so I think please carry on.
Great. All right, so kind of these are the 6 things that I'm hoping to kind of follow through with and kind of tell you a little bit about and get your feedback about as well, because some of these puzzles, as I said previously, we would really love your help. So the first one is just, you know, were people even interested in this, and did they even attend, right? And so, you know, almost everyone who was assigned to the treatment attended these trainings, and on average 15 of 16 people attended kind of per the village, and there wasn't any kind of difference by these treatments. And if you're looking at kind of the cash transfer group, again, amongst the cash transfer group, about 94% of the cash transfer villages received their cash transfer. There were similar payouts between kind of the unconditional and the conditional cash transfer group, you know, and in terms of about almost $20. So what did this mean for adoption? I'll show you adoption along the extensive and the intensive margin. So along the extensive margin, again, kind of very few households in the control group adopted any Demi-Lunes, but, you know, again, about 95% of households in the treatment group adopted any Demi-Lunes, and even if it was just basically 1 Demi-Lune and there wasn't kind of a differential effect by these different treatments. But looking at the intensive margin, because that's what we would really care about, just having one Demi-Lune is not necessarily going to be helpful at recuperating your land. What we see here is that in the control group, they were basically kind of adopting one Demi-Lune. So just to understand how this is measured here, kind of the y-axis is telling us the number of verified Demi-Lunes. So what we did with our enumerators is that they went in, they counted all of the Demi-Lunes in kind of a particular hectare of land or multiple hectares, but it was usually kind of 1 hectare of land. Or 1 plot of land, I should say. They basically then kind of counted the number of Demi-Lunes that were of acceptable quality. So met kind of some key norms for them to, in terms of the dimension, the depth, the slope, things like that. And it also measures it per hectare of degraded land, rather than the total number of Demi-Lunes, but kind of the metric that we're interested in here is per hectare of degraded land. Now, I'm not focusing on a particular type of land, glacis, but just whether or not it was classified as degraded. And what you see here is that on average, kind of the adoption was about 25 additional Demi-Lunes per hectare as compared to the control group. That's about 10% of kind of the ministry norms. Remember, that was 250 to 300. It was relatively higher in one district, and that one district had kind of a higher number of hectares of degraded land as compared to the others. And then if you're kind of now comparing across these treatments, what you can see here is that the UCT early and the CCT arms constructed about 35, if you're the UCT, to 50% more Demi-Lunes as compared with the training alone. So again, they were going up to about 35 Demi-Lunes per hectare of degraded land. And one thing that you might be concerned about is that, well, perhaps kind of the CCT was constructing more Demi-Lunes, but, were they constructing a lot of Demi-Lunes that were of unacceptable quality? And, there's a similar what we're calling quality ratio, meaning kind of the number of Demi-Lunes of acceptable quality as compared with the total number of Demi-Lunes across all of these groups. So, it was about 83%. So we don't see a difference here amongst kind of the different treatments. So how were what were people doing in order to construct these Demi-Lunes, getting back to the initial question? So they were spending about $15 on constructing Demi-Lunes. About half of that came from family labor and the other half came from non-family labor. It was about 175 CFA per Demi-Lune, which is about kind of 35 cents. There wasn't a statistically significant difference between the treatments in terms of kind of the amount that was spent. The complementary inputs, they were 76 percentage points more likely to plant in Demi-Lunes during the first year. That's really important because, Demi-Lunes can be used as a way to improve basically your soil quality and kind of get more water within the soil, but that means that they were using them for actual planting. And they were 21 percentage points more likely to use manure. And manure here is a key complementary input. It's something that's suggested, it's not necessarily required, but the combination of the Demi-Lune and manure has kind of greater improvements on yields and soil quality. Again, there were no statistically significant differences between the treatments here. What did that mean then for agricultural output? So in terms of agricultural output, I'll come back to kind of labor and land allocation in a minute. But one of the things that's of concern here is crop failures, and that's one of the reasons that Demi-Lunes are constructed. If you were in any treatment group, you were about 2 percentage points less likely to kind of experience a crop failure. That being said, if you look at the mean of the control, it's only 5%. So it's not necessarily very high at this point. And then in terms of the production, a z-score production of the total crops, but also kind of the value of production, it increased both of those by about 0.14 standard deviations, marginally statistically significant at the 10% level, but didn't really have any impact on kind of the types of crops that you were planting or the number of crops that you were selling. So to put this into real terms, basically those farmers in treatment villages produced about 95 kilograms more as compared with the control group. They were earning, their revenues were about $40 more as compared to the control group. And that's kind of about a 15% increase in terms of the value of their production as compared with the control group. So one of the problems with the z-scores and looking at total production is that it doesn't necessarily show kind of potentially how this might be heterogeneous across crops. And so we were looking at 5 different crops. I mean, on average, people are producing 4 crops, although that can range from kind of 3 up until 7 or 8, but we saw that it didn't really change kind of what people were planting. And so what this shows is, with the control group in black and the treatment group in gray is kind of the average production in kilograms for a number of different crops. And so I'm going to be focusing on 4 of them. So first of all, in terms of sorghum and sesame, there were kind of statistically significant increases in sorghum and sesame production. It was about a 20% increase as compared to the control group in sorghum and a 58% increase in sesame. There were increases in millet and cowpea production. There was about a 10% increase, but those were not statistically significant at any conventional levels. There was no change on peanuts. So peanuts is something that cannot or should not be kind of planted in demi-lunes. And where this is mainly coming from is that we see these differential effects in millet production between the training group and the UCT and the CCT arms. So remember, the UCT and the CCT arms were the arms that kind of had a higher number of demi-lunes per hectare of degraded land. Everyone seemed to be planting kind of cowpea, sesame, and sorghum in their demi-lunes, but kind of the UCT and CCT arms seem to be using those demi-lunes for additional kind of millet production as compared with the training alone. So how are people then using their labor and their land? So thinking about kind of, as I said previously, in terms of half of the construction of demi-lunes was done by family labor, the other half was done by non-family labor. Okay, even though this is during the slack agricultural period, obviously you need to get that labor from somewhere. So kind of 2 things to be looking at here. So number 1, there was kind of a slight decrease in the number of household members who migrated. About, as I said previously, 1 person engages in kind of seasonal off migration. So there was a slight decrease there, which is the first column. Also, households in the treatment group were kind of selling less of their own family labor to earn income. That went, and it wasn't kind of an exact trade-off, but it went to basically them kind of using more of that labor to basically increase their production of demi-lunes. So you can see here in the 3rd column that they were using about 15 person days of household labor to construct these demi-lunes. And then they were basically hiring about 6 person days of non-family labor to construct demi-lunes. There were no impacts here on kind of hiring anyone that had nothing to do with demi-lunes. Let me just stop there.
Jenny, yeah, that's good timing that you have just under 10 minutes left.
Okay.
And also Chris has a question.
Yes, tell me.
Sorry, you may be getting to this, which if you are, just put me off. But I'm trying to get my head around what the returns to this are then, because you say $40 extra crops. It's $80 to put 230 demi-lunes on a hectare, but you only put 25 on. So that sounds like an enormous return.
$80 for what?
But I thought you said that was $80. It was what the cost was to build the demi-lunes on a hectare.
Right. So they're getting $40 in revenues for constructing, for use. So basically what they're putting into it is $15. They're putting in $25 and they're getting out $40 basically, right. From what they've constructed.
And they're not using more fertilizer or other kinds of inputs or anything like that. It's all just this labor so it's 100 and whatever that is, 60% returns on the cost of building these things. Yeah. Every year. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but yes, but then, yeah. So let's come back to that a little bit, because maybe I didn't fully understand your question, and I want to push that a little bit more, because I think that it's an insight that's going to be important. Let me briefly just go through these things, because which is 1, what about land use? This is kind of the major area where we would expect to see a result. This basically shows the treatment as compared to the control in terms of number of hectares cultivated, the number of degraded hectares cultivated, and self-reported soil quality. There's a slight improvement in self-reported soil quality, but again, that's self-reported. There's no kind of increase or statistically significant increase in the number of degraded hectares cultivated, although the point estimated of that is about equal to the number of demi-lunes constructed. So they kind of match up mechanically. And then in terms of well-being, what we found was that basically, people had kind of a higher asset index, so about 0.17 standard deviations higher. They were less likely to be food insecure, that's column 3, and they had a higher diet diversity. What's interesting about that asset index, and then this gets a little bit into what kind of Chris was talking about in terms of costs, is that primarily came from them owning a shovel and owning a pickaxe, which in fact are the 2 inputs that you require to construct these demi-lunes during the first year. So what does this mean for adoption over time? And this is why I would like to get back to a little bit kind of how we're thinking about costs and benefits. What you can just basically see here is 2018, 2019, and 2020. Again, black is in the control group, and gray is any treatment group, regardless of the treatment. You can see that there's kind of a significant increase in the control group. You know, the extensive margin was stable in the treatment group. They were already at 95% anyway, but the extensive margin in the control group went up considerably from about 1 to 17%, 1% in 2018 and 17% in 2020. Again, kind of they went from 1 Demi-Lune to about 7 Demi-Lunes in 2020. And there was this increase, but there was kind of this increase of about 5 to 4 additional Demi-Lunes per year, very unlike kind of what we saw the first year, was there was kind of a substantial increase in adoption. So one thing to note here is that 90% of the treatment households still had operational Demi-Lunes by 2020. So they were still using them, they were still planting in them. I think that's the better metric, because as I said, these things can last for 3 years. So they were still actively using them. They weren't kind of going into disrepair. But we've only have kind of any outcomes on agricultural production after the first year. So the cost, as I said previously, is an accounting exercise. $15 for labor didn't kind of affect non-Demi-Lune labor. There was no statistically significant reduction in revenues from non-family labor sold, and they were basically spending $5 on this material. So the kind of the outlay of cost was $20, but if we count that reduction in the revenues from them selling family labor as a cost as well, then it's about $25, and then they got on average about $40 in terms of their additional crop income. But as we said previously, and kind of the big puzzle for us is, okay, if this is seemingly so profitable, why is adoption so much lower than the recommended norms, which, you know, is about 10 to 15% of these recommended norms. And I say 15% because in the one region where we saw relatively higher adoption, they were basically getting up to about 40 Demi-Lunes per hectare, but that's still kind of insignificant. So the 3 things that I'd like to kind of end up with in the next few minutes is, you know, these 3 puzzles that we're kind of thinking about, which is 1, you know, why was the training so effective alone in terms of increasing adoption? 2, why didn't we see the financial incentives of having more of an effect? There was a statistically significant effect in the first year, about 35 to 50% more. And then 3, you know, why don't we see these higher levels of adoption over time, again, if it's seemingly so profitable? So in terms of kind of the training mechanism, there's lots of ways in which training could potentially be having an impact on adoption along the intensive and the extensive margin. That can be, you know, that you now know about it, or it provides you with technical advice, or it potentially persuaded farmers by providing them with information, or allowed for social learning, or then kind of, you know, empowered and motivated farmers by, you know, signaling some type of interest. We really think that it's the first 2. The first one, you know, a lot of people already knew about this technology, given kind of its promotion over the course of a number of years. And so it was something that people knew about, but we think that kind of the trainings really provided technical advice and allowed for some type of interaction and learning. And the reason that we think about that is that when we look at a test of, you know, how to construct Demi-Lunes, what we find is that basically, you know, the areas where training had the most impact was in the 3 areas that are kind of some of the most important in terms of having a technical impact on your agricultural production, increasing the effectiveness of Demi-Lunes. And the 2 that are most important here is that, did you know about the spacing, and did you know about the dimensions? And those are the things that had the greatest impact on kind of farmers' knowledge. The second thing why we think it was affecting social learning, not just those who were actually trained, but those who kind of might have been in the village, is that when we went back in 2020, we noticed whether or not kind of any of your neighbors had also constructed Demi-Lunes. Now, obviously, we can kind of debate whether or not this is a relevant sample, given the fact that they weren't randomly assigned, but we saw that, you know, in the control group, about 18% of their neighbors had constructed any Demi-Lunes, and that went up to about almost 70% or 65% in the any treatment group. So why the financial incentives didn't have more of an effect, I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, but happy to discuss that in the Q&A. But, you know, one of the things that we think about is that potentially information is really the key constraint here. You know, we could be concerned about complementary constraints in the labor market, but we don't necessarily see any GE effects in the labor market or kind of impacts on wages in the control group villages as well. And the reasons why we don't see higher levels of adoption, which is something that we're trying to kind of unpack right now, is, you know, maybe there are these heterogeneity of these profits or costs that we aren't really capturing, and that we really need to do a little bit more with our stratification to better understand that in terms of kind of gender and also in terms of farm size. The way in which we're measuring degraded land, as I said below, Demi-Lunes are really appropriate for something called a glacis. And our measure right now is just a hectare of degraded land, but not a glacis. Once we do that and do some type of very crude correction, we see that it goes basically up to about 45, but it doesn't get anywhere near kind of 250. Maybe people are forgetting about when to construct demi-lunes, and we did a mini experiment during the 3rd year, calling them to remind them. Maybe these ministry norms are something that are just, simply kind of a calculation and aren't necessarily considering costs and benefits. And then maybe there's issues about risk conversion or kind of complementary constraints. And one of the things that we looked at there was kind of whether or not farmers had enough seeds, whether or not they had sufficient amounts of manure. We think that what could really be driving this here is the heterogeneity of costs, the way in which we're measuring the land, and then kind of some issues with kind of complementary access to manure in particular, because only about 20% of farmers said that seed was a constraint for them. So I'm going to end it there, just because I know that there are a number of questions and I want to be able to respect time, and happy to take those.
Great, so thank you so much, Jenny. So now if people have questions, can they just use the raise the hand functionality, and we'll call and unmute you. So I'm going to start with Julio.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. I just had a clarification question on the labor use results. I was just wondering what the recall period was for the labor use, and whether that was labor that was specific for the construction of demi-lunes, or whether that was across all agricultural activities. And apologies if I missed that.
No, that's a great question. So we did ask questions specifically related to family and non-family labor use for constructing demi-lunes. And then we had saying, outside of demi-lune construction, did you hire labor for all agricultural purposes, or did you sell any family labor for all agricultural purposes? So we did differentiate it between demi-lune and non-demi-lune purposes.
Next, I'm going to call on Rossa.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks very much, Jenny. I wanted to ask about this recommendation of 250 demi-lunes per hectare, and how it relates to like the returns to scale. So if there's constant returns to scale on your piece of land, then it would make sense that people just keep constructing more, especially in a CCT. But if there's diminishing returns, then maybe the fact that they're kind of building so few of these compared to the recommendation is kind of like economically rational in some way. And then I wondered if like the recommendation could actually be harmful, because maybe it's like giving people this aspiration that seems completely unrealistic if they just don't have the capital to invest in that.
It's a great question, and I would say that I completely agree. And that one of the things that we're trying to do right now is we're trying to better understand kind of the nature of costs, to see whether or not there are potentially diminishing returns, and then B, we're trying to talk with the ministry a little bit more to better understand where these recommendations come from. From what we can find out so far, it really does seem as if it's quite, there is an element to it of like capturing the rainwater, so having kind of what they call like a 4:1 ratio, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be based on kind of economic returns as well. And I very much take your point. This is a discussion that we're having with them right now.
Simon, do you want to go next?
Yeah, my question maybe relates to both of the previous ones. I'm wondering if the narrative is that these households are making a big mistake by not adopting, or now we've helped them a little bit, but we could see why they were kind of close to indifferent. And I'm sort of thinking of Tavneet's Econometrica paper, where she also talks about heterogeneity and sort of the net payoff. In that regard, I'm particularly wondering, I know you accounted for the wages in terms of labor, both hired in and then not hired out, but how do we think about just the cost of standing in the sun to construct one of these things? And is it possible that that might rationalize a lot of the kind of control group decision not to adopt?
Right. So, okay. I mean, whether or not it's a big mistake or whether or not kind of there are these heterogeneity in returns, I mean, I think that there's two things that I want to think about, which is one, I mean, the way that I would think about this land is that this land, which is a glacis, is completely unproductive. So you can't use it at all. And so, you know, already kind of the land market in Niger, I mean, they have land tenure, but the land market in Niger is not very vibrant in terms of kind of sales and purchases. But if you have completely unproductive land and you can't use it, then you have no other use for it because people aren't going to buy it. So, I mean, I do think that potentially, you know, better understanding why people are, the question is, are they actually under adopting, or are they just making a kind of a rational economic decision? And I think we need to do a better job of understanding kind of the productivity of this land and measuring this land to see whether or not kind of it's actually appropriate. B, I think we need to do a better job of measuring costs. And C, I very much take your point that this is really hard work. I mean, you know, you can do basically 3 of these in a day, maybe 2. It's an incredible amount of work. Even if people are using family labor, when we say kind of how much are you paying to that family labor, they're literally paying for extra food, because you're, you know, exerting so much time and energy during the hot season under the sun. There isn't a lot of water, and then you don't necessarily, you're kind of a little bit kind of capital constrained as well. And so that is something that I think would be something to really think about in terms of, does that actually make sense? And we're not
Thank you. Sure. Thank you.
Chris, do you want to go again?
Yeah. So I guess I want to ask about the other side of the equation, which is the revenue side, the $40, and what can you tell us about the market for these crops? Are they selling the whole thing? Is some of this is they're consuming themselves? And how would they kind of think about, if I did a bunch more of this and ended up with a bunch more crop, you know, is there going to be somebody there to buy it? That, you know, those kinds of things.
Yeah, so of those 5 crops, millet and sorghum are your basic staple food crops that people are going to be eating. Cowpea and sesame are your cash crops, and then basically they're going to be selling them and either selling them right away or waiting. In terms of the market for cowpea, for all of these is quite robust. Sesame a little bit less so. Cowpea mainly is purchased by Nigeria, and sesame is the one that I would say there's a lot more kind of interannual variation in production and prices, and the market isn't quite as robust. That being said, the amount that they're actually producing is quite small. It's, I think, you know, maybe 15 kilograms, and I wouldn't know how many plants that actually is. So I think that it's something that you do additionally for additional income, but I'm a little bit less concerned about, yeah, the markets are pretty robust for all of these.
I'm going to call on Shruti Patel from BioVision. If you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Yeah, great research, Jenny. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the knowledge aspects of the training. I mean, so you mentioned the spacing and the dimensions being like most influential in terms of the knowledge gains. Can you say a little bit more about how that was featured in the training itself? As in, did you kind of emphasize that in the materials from the start because you knew that that was where a gap was, or was this kind of just new knowledge that you gained?
So I would say that the trainings, we tried to make them very much in the principle of adult learning. So quite interactive, you know, repetitive in some senses, that you learned about it and then you actually did it, and then you actually had a book as part of this. And we did very much focus on the technical dimensions of this to make sure that it's done right, to avoid that there were any issues. You know, in an extreme case, if someone ended up doing something wrong, you know, in terms of it, whether or not it was too deep or you put it in the wrong area, then that could be kind of harmful for your crops. So we wanted to kind of ensure that that knowledge was passed on, especially because in general, people knew about Demi-Lunes, but didn't necessarily seem to know exactly what they needed to do to make them as effective as they needed to be.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm just going to wrap up there. I know that there might be a couple more questions, but I'm sure Jenny will be happy to answer those if you contact her directly. So I just wanted to mention that we're going to have the webinar at the same time next Wednesday. And we have Rushi Jia from the University of California, San Diego, who's going to be presenting the nexus of elites and war mobilization and empirical investigation. So I hope to see many of you there. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks for all the questions.
Thanks.
Jenny.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Jenny.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Jenny.
See you again.